When she whispered that her husband was out of town, I never expected one night to change everything between us. The evening began quietly, the kind of quiet where every small sound seemed amplified, the faint hum of the fridge, the dull tick of the clock above the kitchen doorway, even the creak of the old wooden floor under my shoes as I crossed the hallway. I wasn't expecting her to be there, waiting in the doorway. My landlord's wife stood framed against the soft glow of the kitchen light, her posture elegant but slightly tense, as though she had been holding her breath for too long. Her eyes caught mine with that steady, knowing look she carried so naturally. She had the kind of beauty that didn't ask for attention, it simply drew you in, quietly, insistently, like the tide. Tonight, her hair was loosely tied back, with a few strands falling free around her face. It made her seem less composed, more human. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, threaded with something I couldn't name. "He's out of town." The words hung in the air, deceptively ordinary, yet heavy enough to shift the entire atmosphere of the room. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. It wasn't about the fact that her husband was gone. It was about the pause afterward, the silence that pressed between us, the almost imperceptible rise and fall of her chest as she waited to see how I would respond. I should have nodded, said something neutral, kept the moment safe. Instead, before I could stop myself, I answered in a voice softer than I intended. "Then tonight's ours." The words slipped out, not reckless, but edged with a kind of trembling daring. As soon as I said them, I felt the weight of their meaning press into me. What had I just invited? What line had I just agreed to blur? For a heartbeat, she didn't move. Then, slowly, her eyes lowered, lashes casting delicate shadows against her cheek. The faintest curl of a smile touched the corner of her lips, not playful, not careless, but something more private, as if she had been waiting for me to say it all along. I felt the air shift between us, as though the house itself had leaned in to listen. My pulse picked up, each beat too loud in my ears. I was suddenly aware of every detail around us, the faint smell of coffee lingering from earlier, the way the evening breeze tapped gently against the window panes, the warmth of the overhead light softening the sharp lines of her face. Nothing about the moment was rushed. It wasn't the kind of scene that erupted suddenly into passion. No, it was quieter, deeper. The kind of moment that asked for patience, that demanded to be felt second by second. She didn't step closer, and neither did I. The distance between us remained, but it felt thinner somehow, fragile, like glass that could crack with the slightest pressure. And in that stillness, I realized something. Tonight wasn't about what might happen. It was about what was already happening, the unspoken invitation, the careful balancing of restraint and desire, the sense that the rules of the world had shifted, just for us, just for tonight. She didn't say much after that first moment. Instead, she stepped aside and gestured toward the kitchen, as if the natural thing to do was to share a meal. And maybe it was. Maybe that's why the silence between us felt less like avoidance and more like an invitation. The kitchen light was warm, casting a soft, golden glow on the counters. A pot of water was already simmering on the stove, steam fogging the edges of the nearby window. She moved easily through the space, her movements graceful and practiced, like someone who had spent years perfecting the small rituals of home. I found myself watching her, the way she reached for the olive oil, the way she brushed a strand of hair behind her ear without thinking. "Do you cook?" she asked suddenly, glancing over her shoulder with a half-smile. I laughed quietly. "Not well enough to admit it." Her smile deepened, the kind that softened her whole face. "Then you can help me tonight. I'll trust you with the important task of stirring." I stepped closer, taking the wooden spoon she offered. Our fingers brushed in the handover, not an accident, not entirely deliberate, but enough to make me aware of the warmth of her skin. The contact lingered in my memory even after she turned back to the counter. The smell of garlic and herbs filled the room, wrapping itself around us. It was comforting, domestic, yet charged in a way I couldn't quite explain. I stirred slowly, listening to the quiet bubbling of the sauce, listening to her voice as she talked. She asked about my day, about the kind of work I was doing. Simple questions, but asked with a genuine attentiveness that made me want to give her more than simple answers. I told her small stories, things that didn't matter much on the surface but felt important to share with her. She laughed at the right moments, a soft, melodic laugh that carried more warmth than I expected. At one point, as I handed her a plate from the cupboard, my hand brushed against hers again. This time, neither of us looked away. Our eyes met, and for just a second too long, the air between us thickened, like a pause we both felt but neither acknowledged. Dinner was simple: pasta, salad, a bottle of wine she had opened. Just for tonight. We sat across from each other at the small kitchen table. At first, it felt proper, almost careful. But as the meal went on, the distance closed. Our chairs seemed closer. Our knees touched under the table. At first, it was accidental. Then it wasn't. She didn't pull her leg back, and I didn't either. We just let it rest there, a quiet, steady pressure that spoke louder than words. The conversation flowed in fits and starts, sometimes playful, sometimes thoughtful. I found myself studying the way she held her glass, the way her fingers curled lightly around the stem. She looked at me once, a little too directly, and I had to glance down at my plate to steady myself. The food was good, but it wasn't the meal that filled me. It was the nearness, the subtle acknowledgement that something unspoken was moving between us, thread by thread, touch by touch. By the time we finished, I knew the night was no longer ordinary. The quiet dinner had become something else entirely, a doorway into a closeness we had both felt but never named. After dinner, she carried the dishes to the sink, her movements unhurried, graceful in their simplicity. I offered to help, but she shook her head with a small smile, saying, "You cooked. I'll clean." I laughed at that. I had barely stirred a sauce, but I didn't press. Instead, I leaned against the doorway, watching her hands move through the warm water, the light catching faint drops as she rinsed each plate. There was something quietly mesmerizing about the way she inhabited the moment. No rush, no pretense, just the rhythm of water and porcelain. And yet, beneath that calm exterior, I felt the same undercurrent pulling at me, the awareness of us being alone, of her husband gone, of the unspoken tension building thread by thread. When she finally dried her hands, she looked over at me. "Come," she said softly, a simple invitation. She led the way into the living room. Only one lamp was on, casting an ember glow that left the corners of the room in gentle shadow. The storm outside had picked up, rain whispering against the windows, the occasional gust of wind rattling the glass. It gave the room a cocoon-like feeling, as though the rest of the world had fallen away, leaving just us in this circle of light. She sat on the couch, not at one end, but near the middle. Close enough that when I joined her, the space between us felt intentional, deliberate. Her shoulder brushed lightly against mine, and though it could have been dismissed as casual, the warmth of her touch lingered far longer than accident would allow. We spoke of little things at first: the weather, the book resting on her coffee table, the storm outside. But beneath each word lay something heavier, quieter. I noticed the way her eyes would drift toward me when she thought I wasn't looking, the way her fingers tapped lightly against her knee, restless in their own quiet language. At one point, she reached for the glass of wine on the table. Her wrist brushed my arm, and I caught the faintest trace of her perfume, something floral, delicate, the kind of scent that made you lean closer without meaning to. Inside, I wrestled with myself. She's married. She's older. This is not my place. But then she turned her head, and her eyes locked on mine, steady, searching, unflinching. It wasn't a look that asked a question. It was a look that held an answer. For a few long seconds, the air thickened. My chest tightened, and I could hear the faint tremor in my own breath. She didn't move closer, but she didn't move away either. And in that stillness, I realized how fragile this moment was, like glass that could shatter with one wrong move, but also gleam with impossible beauty if held carefully. I didn't speak. Neither did she. Words would have only broken the spell. Instead, I let myself sit in the glow of the room, in the warmth of her presence pressed lightly against mine, in the quiet storm outside that seemed to echo the one building inside both of us. And though nothing had yet happened, I felt the line between what was safe and what was forbidden grow thinner, almost transparent, as if all it would take was one breath too close to cross it. The storm outside grew heavier, rain streaking the windows with silver lines, a low roll of thunder humming in the distance. Inside, the living room glowed softly, a small island of warmth against the restless night. She shifted slightly on the couch, her arm brushing mine again, her breath carrying a subtle, lingering warmth into the narrow space between us. At first, the conversation stayed light. She asked about my family, about whether I liked living here, about what I wanted to do someday. I answered honestly, though always aware of the way her eyes lingered as I spoke, as if she wasn't just listening to my words, but reading something underneath them. Then her tone changed. Her gaze dropped to her hands, folded loosely in her lap. "You know," she said softly, "sometimes I wonder when I became invisible." I turned toward her, caught off guard by the quiet honesty in her voice. She wasn't someone who usually wore her feelings plainly. Her confidence always seemed effortless, like a shield she carried without thinking. But now, sitting beside me, her guard had slipped just enough for me to glimpse what lay beneath. "Invisible?" I echoed, my voice careful. She gave a small, almost embarrassed laugh, shaking her head. "Not to the world. Not to strangers. But to him." She didn't need to say his name. The weight of her husband hung between us, unspoken yet present. She pressed her lips together, as though debating whether to continue, then sighed softly. "It's like he stopped seeing me a long time ago. Not in the big ways, but in the small ones. The things that matter." Her words struck something deep inside me. I didn't know what to say at first, but I knew I couldn't let the moment pass in silence. "I see you," I said quietly, the words slipping out before I could stop them. She looked up then, her eyes wide, searching mine for any trace of insincerity. Whatever she found there seemed to steady her, because her shoulders eased, and she let out a breath she had been holding. I hesitated, then reached out, my hand brushing gently against hers where they rested on her lap. My fingers lingered, hesitant but purposeful, waiting to see if she would pull away. She didn't. Instead, her hand turned beneath mine, palm upward, as though inviting me to stay. The warmth of her skin seeped into me, grounding me in the moment. Her hand was soft, delicate, yet there was a strength there too, the kind of strength that comes from carrying burdens quietly for too long. She didn't look away. Her eyes shimmered faintly in the low light, not with tears exactly, but with something more fragile, more vulnerable. "You shouldn't have to hear all this," she whispered. "I want to," I replied, my voice firmer now. "I'd rather hear the truth than pretend it isn't there." The storm outside cracked with thunder, a flash of light brushing across her features. She leaned slightly closer, our hands still joined, her voice lower than before. "It feels good to be seen again." And in that moment, with her confession laid bare and her hand resting in mine, the distance between us seemed to dissolve, not with passion, but with something deeper, something truer. The storm had softened outside, rain falling in steadier rhythms now, like a lullaby against the windows. Inside, the living room seemed smaller, the air heavier, though nothing in the room had changed. It was simply the space between us, or rather, the lack of it, that made everything feel different. Her hand was still in mine, warm and steady, and though either of us had spoken for several minutes, the silence was not uncomfortable. It was electric, each second stretching longer than the last. I became acutely aware of the details, the faint rise and fall of her breathing, the way her thumb traced absent circles against the edge of my palm, the delicate glow of the lamplight softening the lines of her face. She shifted slightly on the couch, turning toward me more fully. In that movement, her knee brushed against my thigh, a light contact that could have been accidental, but it wasn't. She didn't pull away, and I didn't either. The simple press of her leg against mine carried more weight than any words could. I felt a tension build in my chest, the kind that demanded release, yet I hesitated. She's older. She's married. This is dangerous. The thoughts circled like restless birds, but then she looked up at me, and all of them scattered. Her eyes lingered on mine, steady, unafraid. There was no coyness there, no performance, just honesty, unguarded and raw. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Slowly, almost without thinking, I raised my free hand and reached toward her. A strand of hair had slipped loose, brushing against her cheek. My fingertips grazed her skin as I tucked it gently behind her ear. The touch was feather-light, but the warmth that spread from that single point of contact was overwhelming. She didn't move away. Instead, she leaned, not much, just enough that her cheek pressed softly against my hand, holding it there. The gesture undid me. It was tender, trusting, intimate in a way words could never capture. Her lips parted, though no sound came out. I whispered her name, not loudly, but like a question, like a prayer. Her hand rose to my wrist, fingers curling lightly around it, not to pull me away but to anchor me there. Her touch was firm yet gentle, her skin warm against mine. For a heartbeat, we stayed like that, her cheek resting against my palm, her hand steadying mine against her skin, both of us caught in a moment that balanced on the edge of something larger. The room seemed to vanish. There was no storm outside, no clock ticking, no world beyond the small space we occupied. Just the quiet pull between us, undeniable and fragile. I wanted to close the distance, to lean in until her lips were against mine, but I didn't. Something in her silence told me not to rush, not to break what was unfolding so delicately. And so I stayed there, my hand against her cheek, her fingers holding me in place, our bodies just barely touching, yet already saying everything that needed to be said. The storm outside had quieted into a steady rain, a rhythmic patter against the windows that seemed to sync with the quickening beat of my heart. The house itself felt suspended, as if holding its breath with us. The lamp's amber glow wrapped around the room like a blanket, but between us, the warmth was something different, charged, restless, alive. Her cheek was still resting against my hand, her fingers curled lightly around my wrist, and though the moment was simple, it carried the weight of something that could change everything. She looked at me then, really looked, her eyes tracing mine, her expression soft but unwavering. I felt myself leaning forward before I even realized it. She mirrored the movement, almost imperceptibly, but enough that the space between us shrank into inches. Her breath brushed against my lips, warm, steady, carrying the faint sweetness of wine. Every detail became heightened. The rise and fall of her chest, the faint curve of her lips, the press of her knee against my thigh, anchoring me in place, the quiet thud of my pulse in my ears. It was as though time had slowed, every second stretched out to remind me just how close we were to something inevitable. My hand slid from her cheek to her waist, fingers resting lightly against the curve of her side. The contact was tentative, hesitant, yet undeniable. She didn't move away. In fact, she leaned closer, her own hand pressing gently against my chest, right over my heartbeat. We hovered there, suspended. Our faces close enough that if either of us breathed too deeply, the distance would be gone. I whispered her name again, not as a question this time, but as if speaking it could steady me. Her lips parted, but instead of answering, she drew in a quiet breath, the kind that trembled just enough to give her away. My head tilted slightly, instinct pulling me closer. The moment stretched so thin I thought it would finally break. I could almost feel the softness of her mouth, almost taste the promise waiting there. And then, she pulled back. Just enough to restore the space between us. Her eyes closed briefly, and when she opened them, there was a flicker of conflict there, not rejection, not dismissal, but a battle she was fighting with herself. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "We shouldn't." The words cut through me, though they weren't sharp. They were tender, heavy with restraint. She wasn't saying she didn't want this. She was saying she did, too much. I nodded slowly, forcing myself to swallow the ache in my chest. I know. And yet, even as I said it, neither of us moved apart completely. Her hand was still on my chest, mine still at her waist. The closeness remained, trembling with everything we hadn't let happen. The rain outside pressed on, steady and relentless, as though the world was reminding us that desire doesn't always need to find release to be real. Sometimes, the power is in holding back, in knowing how close you came, in the tension that lingers long after the moment passes. We sat there in silence, breaths still uneven, hearts still racing, knowing we had stepped to the very edge of the line, and stopped just shy of crossing it. The storm had settled into a gentle drizzle, the kind that whispers against the windows instead of battering them. The air in the living room was still heavy with everything that had almost happened, everything we had stopped just short of allowing. Neither of us spoke for a long while. Words felt too clumsy, too fragile for the silence we had created together. She was the first to move. Slowly, carefully, she eased back just far enough to reclaim her hand from my chest, though she left her palm against me for one last beat before pulling away. Her touch lingered in its absence, like warmth in the air after a flame flickers out. I sat back as well, giving her the space she seemed to need, though part of me ached at the small distance now between us. She smoothed her hair behind her ear, her composure carefully returning, but I could see the faint flush still painted across her cheeks, the soft tremor in her breath. "I should let you go," she said finally, her voice low, steady but not without weight. It wasn't a dismissal. It was more like a reminder, a boundary drawn, not because she wanted it, but because she felt she had to. I nodded, though it took effort. "Yeah," I said softly. My voice carried a heaviness I couldn't disguise. She stood, and I followed, the soft sound of our steps echoing in the quiet house as she led me toward the door. The lamp behind us cast our shadows long and thin across the floor, like two figures who had leaned toward each other only to be pulled apart. At the threshold she paused. For a moment she seemed unsure, not of me, but of herself, of what she would allow in this last moment together. Then she turned, facing me fully, and reached for my hand. Her fingers slipped into mine, delicate but firm, both hands wrapping around as though she needed the grounding as much as I did. She held on longer than a simple goodbye would require. Her eyes lifted to mine, shimmering not with tears but with a kind of quiet vulnerability that she had kept hidden all evening until now. "Thank you," she whispered. The words were simple, but they carried a depth that struck me. She wasn't thanking me for dinner or for company. She was thanking me for seeing her, for listening, for holding space for her when she let herself be honest. My chest tightened. Without thinking, I leaned forward. Not to her lips, though every part of me longed for it, but to her temple. I brushed a soft kiss there, lingering just long enough to feel the warmth of her skin, the faintest catch of her breath. It was tender, restrained, and yet somehow more intimate than any kiss on the mouth could have been in that moment. Her eyes closed briefly, her hands tightening around mine, before she whispered back, "Good night, tonight was ours." When I finally stepped out into the night, the cool air met me like a jolt. The drizzle tapped against my shoulders as I walked away, but I hardly felt it. My chest was still burning, my mind replaying every glance, every touch, every almost that had passed between us. It wasn't a night of confessions or grand gestures. It was something quieter, rarer, a night of being seen, of being held in ways that didn't need to be spoken aloud. And though the door had closed behind me, I knew I would carry it with me always, a memory that would glow quietly, like lamplight on a stormy night. Would you like me to stitch all 7 expanded keynotes into a single seamless story script, about 3,800 to 4,000 words total, so you can use it directly for narration? 13.